Father Ockerse, I managed to convince you to come back a second time, 2 weeks in a row. How are you this evening?
I'm quite well, thank you, Thomas. And yourself?
Good. Look, I'm hanging in there through thick and thin. I think all we can do these days is just charge on. You've got to have hope. And that's relevant. Having hope is relevant because that is the theological virtue that I'm hoping to discuss with you tonight. So hope, it's this thing that everybody wants. It's this thing that everybody needs. It gives you an outlook on a brighter future. But in terms of Catholic hope, how would we start a meaningful discussion about what hope means to Catholics?
Well, Thomas, I mean, if we're gonna talk about hope, of course, as soon as you mention the word hope, people have in mind, I think most of the time, what we would call natural hope. But what we want to talk about is theological hope, the theological virtue of hope. Natural hope is just quite simply a looking forward to some good which is not yet possessed. It's even a name that we give to one of the passions of the soul, these movements of the soul towards goods or away from perceived evils. And so, the passion of hope is a passion which moves in our soul, seeking after some good which is not yet possessed, but which is perceived as being possible. And not necessarily easy to obtain, but certainly possible. Whereas a theological virtue has this notion of wanting to obtain a good which is perceived as possible, not necessarily easy, but it's perceived as being possible. And that good, in fact, what we call the object of theological hope is God himself. And I can't remember if last week when we were talking of the theological virtue of faith, I can't actually remember a whole week back, but I may have mentioned, I'll mention it again anyway, but we call them theological virtues, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. We call them theological precisely because they have a direct link or direct object in God. And the Greek word for God is theos. And so from theos, we get theology, the study of God, and theological virtues which have as an object, a direct object, God himself in some aspect. The other virtues we call moral virtues. Those virtues are not directed to God, but they're directed to some way of doing things, some action, and in fact that's where we get the word moral. It's from the Latin word mores, a custom or way of doing things. So when we're saying hope is a theological virtue, we're saying hope as in this desire or this movement, if you like, of the soul, which is inspired by God's grace, but wants to obtain God himself as our happiness. In that God is infinitely happy in himself, and he wants to share that happiness with us, and our theological virtue of hope reaches out to that, hoping to obtain that happiness, the eternal happiness, and hoping by the motive of God's own infinite goodness and mercy and the fact that he's faithful to his promises. So that's how we get our definition of hope, in fact, is that it's this theological virtue which hopes to obtain eternal happiness, or trust that we shall obtain eternal happiness, trusting on the infinite mercy and goodness of God, who's faithful to his promises.
That's a really interesting distinction you just drew then, Father, between, I think you called it natural hope and the theological virtue of hope. You used the word theos, and a word that sort of sounds a bit like theos is telos, which is the Greek philosophical notion of goal-directedness. And is there a telos necessary in the Catholic virtue of hope? Because if you look at natural hope, it's I think you described it as just that hope of attaining an end and getting closer to that end. That could be for one person, it could be a bad end, an evil end. Is there?
Yes. The thing is that, funnily enough, the philosophical viewpoint, if you like, on the soul, is that the will is always seeking good. It always seeks some kind of good. Whether that is a real good or merely a perceived good can change. I mean, for instance, the drug addict is still seeking good in his addiction. The rest of mankind will say, well, that's not good. There's something bad there. There's something that's disordered there. But in the mind of the drug addict, that is something good. He's getting something that he perceives to be good. It's just that he happens to have made a wrong judgment over what is good and what is not good. So even in the question of natural hope, when people are seeking after something as an end, they're seeking it precisely because it's desired. And it's desired because it's perceived to be good. So yeah, it's always going to be some kind of perceived good. And in some cases, it will be a real good that one is seeking by that virtue of hope. But yeah, that very important distinction, if we're going to talk about theological virtues, is that we're not seeking the goods of this world, even though they may be good in themselves. There are things which are good in themselves that are not God. Human kindness or friendship is something which is good in itself. And there are other things which are neither good nor bad in themselves. It just depends on how we use them. As for instance, money is good if you're using it for good ends, and it's not so good if you're using it for bad ends. So you don't really desire it in itself, but you do desire it for what it can get you, and that can be a good thing. But it can only be the object really of natural hope. However, it's interesting that theologians say that these lesser goods, what we might call natural goods, can be considered to come under the virtue, the theological virtue of hope, insofar as they could be directed towards God. I could hope to obtain someone's friendship because I think that their friendship would help me to obtain God, the happiness that God is in heaven. And so that would be an example of where you could have a lesser object for the virtue, but it's still contained within the object of the theological virtue of hope.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. And if we could spend a bit of time talking now, well, we sort of already just have, but the practical role and the importance of having the theological virtue of hope in our lives. Because if you look at the three virtues, you've got faith, and faith is fairly easily understood in terms of the importance of it. It opens the door to understanding the life of God and the church.
And in fact, it's the basis of the virtue of hope. You can't hope after something which you don't believe. There has to be. This is what we mean when we say there has to be a good there, and it has to be perceived as good before you can start hoping after it. So the theological virtue is absolutely not secondary, but it's consequent upon the virtue of faith.
And what would a lively exercise of the virtue of hope look like to somebody? Just a couple of examples. So you've got people, how would I say this? Novenas, and people that hold on to novenas and know that, or have this deep, there's that word again, faith, that every prayer that they give will, every prayer that they make will be answered by God. Then you've got somebody who has a far more reserved sort of approach, where they sort of throw their hands up in the air. They look at a situation like what's going on in the world now, and they go, divine providence, but there's a hope that ultimately God's in control. And then you've got people that go, I have no idea what's going on. I don't understand why God is doing this, but I have this hope that God is in control. Do you see what I mean? The varying degrees, but all of them are underpinned by a hope in a God. Is there some sort of practical application that this can all take in our lives?
Well, you kind of put me on the spot, Thomas. The practical application of that virtue of hope does play out in the difficult moments, I think, of our lives. Because when things are going well, it's easy for us to be caught up in the goods of this world. The things of this world seem to be sufficient for us. The whole it's used in a completely different context, but the distributist movement, which sort of said, "Oh, every man with his 5 acres and a cow and his little house," and that's the picture of contentment of life, everything that we need, and we're perfectly happy. That works when things are going well. When things start to get difficult, and they do get difficult, it's a condition of our fallen human nature that life is never completely cruisy. And I am always astounded by those little insights you sometimes get into somebody else's life, and you realize that this outside facade of being very happy people, or being very I don't know, self-sufficient people, sufficiently provided with the things of this world, that veneer kind of just disappears, and you discover that underneath there is actually someone who faces real problems and who feels the same crosses that we ourselves experience. I mean, I'm thinking just a couple of days ago, I in fact was in a hospital, not for myself. I was visiting a lady there who's quite sick, and on my way, I mean, I'd signed in, as you do now in the COVID normal of our new world. You have to sign in on your way into the ward, and I'd spoken to the receptionist, and she seemed like a very nice girl, very happy, and I signed in. But on my way out, she was in tears about something, but it was obviously this moment in her life where she'd just broken down, and she was sobbing her heart out to one of the nurses. And I sort of thought to myself, wow, it's a completely different person from the person I saw literally 30 minutes ago as I walked in the door. And I think it's those moments where, practically speaking, a Catholic has a kind of a handle on the extremes of his emotion. And we have it actually given to us in the Requiem Mass for the dead, for the funeral Mass, in the traditional Mass. That epistle that we have is from St. Paul to the Thessalonians, and he says, "Brethren, I would have you not to be as the pagans who have no hope." In other words, yes, you've lost someone that you love, but this is not a moment in which we give complete vent to our grief, and we are completely despairing, and we are sorry. We have this grief. We have a great sorrow that we've lost someone that we loved, but at the same time, we know that by the virtue of hope, that separation from them is only a temporary separation. The Catholic can look beyond the grave and say, well, there is a heaven to which I am going. We see it already in the book of Job, one is considered to be one of the oldest books of the Old Testament. And in there, Job, in the moments of absolute extreme affliction, he's lost everything in this world. He's even lost his friends. His friends and his wife are reviling him. And he says, but I know that my God liveth. I know that there's a happiness waiting for me. And that hope is what tides him over. It gives him that strength and that foundation and that handle on the extremes of his emotion to really weather the storm and to make it out to the other end. Whereas there are so many people, which I think is becoming more and more of a problem, perhaps even more so now with this whole COVID era. We don't hear a lot about it in the news, but when you talk to mental health care professionals, you discover that there is a great increase in mental issues at the moment, and a corresponding increase in the suicide rate. It's a fact, and it seems to be climbing fairly dramatically at the moment. And I would say that that's very much a practical consequence of not having this theological virtue of hope. People reach this moment in their life when everything seems to have fallen apart, and it's not just their private lives, their individual lives, but it's the whole world around us seems to have just fallen apart. We talk about the new normal precisely because everything that we've stood upon and everything that we've taken for granted our entire lives is just gone overnight, and people are struggling to deal with that. They're struggling to deal with that. And then when they have on top of that the fact that they're facing financial stress or whatever, at that point in time, they just lose hope, they despair, they give up the trust that they can still obtain some good because they don't have a theological virtue of hope. Because even though things may be completely hopeless from the point of view of natural goods, the Catholic knows that nothing's hopeless when you put God in the picture, because we're not just hoping to obtain God, but the motive by which we're hoping is this infinite power and mercy of God, that God's going to work it out somehow. We don't necessarily know how, but we trust that he will.
And whilst we initially distinguished between theological hope and natural hope, I wonder if for natural hope to mean anything, it must by necessity hitch its wagon to the theological virtue of hope. Because if there is nothing beyond the current circumstances and the current chaos that you have from which to extract hope, then there really, could one argue that there really is nothing to hope for, unless there is some underpinning meaning which extends beyond the here and now, which is what we call God.
Yeah, well, I think you are quite right there. Whilst it can certainly be said that natural hope can exist by itself, we can have a purely natural hope of obtaining something, some good. Ultimately, it's true that these things do depend upon a supernatural outlook. That's why I think, you get the impression when you study the classics that the pagan world was a world of despair. It wasn't a world that saw that much good in human nature. And even if you look at the classical gods of the Roman and the Greek era, they're gods who have failings like human beings. They have the same difficulties. Even it seems like they're just living the same life, just on Olympus and not here. It's you read those myths and you just think, wow, is this all they had? Is this all they looked forward to? Is this it's a completely despairing outlook.
Rage, passion, and war, effectively.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it is very much because everything has to kind of hang. It's this word that we have in English, which we don't often think about its roots, but to depend. It literally means to hang on. That comes from the Latin, dependere, to hang on something. And I mean, you can hook something on a hook, and if that hook is stable, it will hold whatever you're putting on it. But if there's nothing to hook it on, then whatever you have is perpetually falling. And I think that's what happens here in this modern world, in this return to paganism in which we're living. We're seeing a return to the same dark, despairing world, which doesn't really have anything to offer. It presents many goods as desirable, and yet there's no happiness in it. And look, I don't know if you want to be controversial or not, but I'm always happy to enter into controversy. But I think one that
let's be controversial, Father.
Yeah, there's one thing which I think certainly stands out, and which the modern world does not want to admit, and we can see it going on right now in the US and the Senate committee hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, is this whole question of abortion. The world promises happiness to a woman by saying, well, you will have control of your body. You can decide what you want to do. You can determine your future, and promises happiness by that. And yet the reality is that these women are taken advantage of in a moment in which they are weak and vulnerable. They're not given the support that's necessary. And they decide to kill this baby that they're carrying in their womb, which is, by the way, not their body. It's someone else's body. And then the consequences for them are huge. They have huge psychological and hormonal problems because of that. They just spiral into depression and so on and so forth. It's just so common, and yet nobody ever wants to point it out. But it's a reality. The world is promising them happiness, but didn't deliver the goods.
I think as a wise man. Oh, sorry. Go on, Father.
No, that's.
I was just going to say, yeah, and a wise man once said, I think if you stop believing in God, you start believing in anything. And I was having an interesting conversation with a friend recently where we were trying to explain just the raging charge of the radical left and how it seems to be getting more extreme, and the right and the conservatives and the Catholics, all those people don't really know what to do. There's this desire to take the moral high ground, and this lack of understanding when the left and the progressives just no longer acknowledge the existence of rules, the existence of meaning. To hell with your rules, we'll just create our own rules. But to keep this within the conversation of hope and some sort of context, it sort of seems like people are innately religious, and people innately have this desire for some form of religion. And Christianity was, on a public level, disemboweled. They did their job very, very well. What they replaced it with, and what they by necessity have to charge on with, is a horrible, meaningless, savage, vile form of existence. Which is why, we live in the world today and we look around how everybody's coping with coronavirus. And when life's music stops playing and you have to sit there and be happy with your own existence or whatever is left of it, you're haunted. it eats away at you, because there is literally nothing to satisfy that inner yearning for something more. And
Yeah. St. Augustine has said it to maybe 1600 years ago. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord. There is a certain need in man to possess God, and that's there because God created him. Everything finds its end in its creator, in what makes it. God, in making man, made him in such a way that God alone can be the one to satisfy completely and supremely all the desires of his human heart. These things cannot be satisfied by pleasure. They cannot be satisfied by temporal possessions, by power, by honor. These things are not enough. And we have the proof. We just have to look around. I mean, if riches were the source of happiness, then no one who is rich would ever be sad. And yet, it is not the fact that we find so many rich people among the saddest on the planet. In our own experience, we've met many people, I'm sure, who have much more than we do, and yet don't seem to have any contentment in their life. And at the very best, they're always perpetually worried somebody's going to steal their riches, or it's going to get out of their hands, won't be in their control, or whatever. People who possess honor never seem to have enough. They're always perpetually worried that they will lose the good reputation that they have with others. And people who have power are always worried that somebody's going to come and stab them in the back. It's just always there. It's never enough. It's never filling those desires of the heart. And it's precisely because God made man in such a way as to need something infinite to satisfy his desires. And there's only one infinite good. It's God himself. And so without him,
you can't you can't be fulfilled. And do you think it's reasonable to suggest that every person at one point in their life has to take that introspective journey? Is that sounds quite cliche, but I mean, a lot of people, their response would be, I'm completely fine. I've got my job. I've got my social, my social outlets. My life is absolutely perfect. And for those people, it may well be. But to use the analogy, at one point in time, the band stops playing, and it's when the noise stops.
I remember once in an interview with that atheist fellow, Dawkins. Is it Dawkins?
Mm-hmm. One off.
I remember him saying in this interview something along the lines of, somebody said, well, what if you're wrong? And what if when you die, you suddenly find yourself face to face with God? And he said something along the lines of, well, I will say to him, why did you hide yourself my whole life? And the reality is, I think that without a doubt, everybody knows by their own conscience, they know that there's something more. They know that there's something higher. And you can quell that. You can simply shut that down, block it out. And I think that's a lot of what goes on in the modern world. It's precisely why we live in such a busy society, in a society which is just perpetually occupied in something. You sit in an airport nowadays. Well, maybe you can't nowadays, but
I wish.
Not so distant times. And you look around and everybody's on their phone or their device or whatever, and just completely focused in a world that's just so busy that hours go by. And I remember talking to someone who put this app on his phone which kind of tracked his use of the phone, and the number of hours that he was spending on his phone over the course of a week was just phenomenal. It was something like getting up to 48 hours in a week. It's a huge proportion of time. And with all of that noise and occupation going on, I don't think there's enough time for people to actually stop and ask themselves the question and say, am I really happy? They somehow managed to double that sense in them. But there's always, as you say, this moment where the band stops playing. And just for a moment, they suspect deep in themselves they are not happy. And just for a moment, they do suspect that there's something more. And that's a moment of grace. It is a moment of grace. And people can cooperate with that grace and say, okay, well, I'm going to find out. Or they can say, no, I keep living my life. But there's, for each and every person, there must be this moment, precisely because of the fact that God is good. If he's going to make man for himself, then in all fairness, he must give each and every single individual human being that opportunity in which he gives them the chance to say, yes, okay, I'm going to look for God, I'm going to find God, or they say no. It's just a necessary thing. God has to give them that opportunity in all fairness and all justice. If he didn't, then it would be very unjust. God obviously doesn't owe anyone anything, but if he does make someone in such a way that they need him to be happy, then he owes it to himself that he gives them the opportunity to obtain that happiness. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so we all have it. We all have it. And as a priest, you do come into contact with these people who have lived, from the point of view of the world, completely normal lives. And they were born and raised as pagans or whatever. They lived a life like just anybody else you see walking down the street, or that you might have come into contact with, or friends that you have, or whatever. But one day they've just had this moment and they've said, okay, well, I'm going to find out. And they turn up at the doors of the step, or the doorstep of the church, and ask. They just ask. And you start talking to them and you start explaining things to them, and they may at that point continue, but some certainly decide that it's too hard. They know it's true, but they just decide that what is asking of them is too much, and they walk away. And then we sort of touched on that, I think, last time we were talking about that virtue of faith. It's but yeah, for everybody, there is a moment in their life, I believe, and I think it's certainly, you could say, consonant with the justice of God and the mercy of God.
And that's from the perspective of a cradle Catholic. I've obviously never had to make that leap of faith in a moment of quiet.
Yeah, look, even with a cradle Catholic, I think there is this moment. We talk about the second conversion. There's this moment in which you make it your own, because you can receive the faith from your parents, and people will tell you, you've been brainwashed just because you received a Catholic education, that's why you're Catholic, You've never really thought about it, and you've never experienced the world. Well, maybe that could be true, and I'm sure there are people like that. But I think for most Catholics, and anyone who's truly going to be a real Catholic, there has to be this point in time in which they say, I'm going to make this my own. It's not just something that's been given to me by my parents, but it's something which I recognize as being true, and which I recognize as must be believed. I recognize that there is something more, that there is this eternal good that we're chasing, which is God himself. And they make those decisions, that second conversion. And very often for a young man or young woman, that may be the moment of a retreat, precisely because a retreat does take you out of the world in which you live, and it puts you in a very foreign environment with that kind of enforced silence, and that gives you that opportunity to think and to pray and to listen for the voice of God, because God never shouts over din. He always whispers to souls, and you have to listen for it.
It's hauntingly beautiful, that whole concept. And one of the frightening things is, I've even found this in my personal experience. So you talk about something that very common, like addiction to spending time on your phone. And it almost seems to be the minute you find those moments of silence, there's this urge to fill it. So it's there when you're lying on the bed twiddling your thumbs and you go, well, what am I going to do? You got the book, you got the brain, and you got the phone, and you reach for the phone and you start flicking through. And it's habit. It's the world we live in. It's no longer, or I don't know if it ever was, but it's certainly not unnormal to do that. But when you think about it and you go, the amount of time that you could be spending thinking, reading, contemplating, and you spend literally killing your eyes scrolling down this infinite page.
And it doesn't do anything to improve you as a human being. There's no, you come away from it without actually having bettered yourself, because
it just distracts you.
We are bettered by the use of our faculties. Like if you want to become strong, you go to the gym and you work out your muscles. You don't become strong by thinking about it. You don't become strong by watching videos on lifting weights. You become strong by doing it. And in the same way, that perfection of your intellect and of your will only comes by thinking, by learning, by willing the good, choosing the good. And that's the only way that it comes. It doesn't come by scrolling of things on your phone. And I think, look, it is sort of this innate laziness that is in us. We always do choose the easy path, and yet paradoxically, the easy path doesn't lead to happiness.
In terms of the final section of this chat, and I think we've already spent a little bit of time talking about it, but really emphasizing the benefit of hope, because who doesn't want to have hope? But having a meaningful hope and the theological virtue of hope, I think, if there was ever a time to market that, it would be now. The widespread despair, mental health issues, we've had those conversations, but everybody is just yearning for something to be able to get their hands on that will bring them through these tumultuous times. And what better than a real living hope?
Yes, and I think for each person, that's an intensely personal thing. You have to, because as I said, it's a grace, and a grace is always offered to a person. It's an individual who receives that call or that invitation, whatever you want to call it, from God. And you have to make a personal decision to follow that or not to follow that. And, you can put it out there as a challenge to your listeners that we all know from our own personal experience, we know that we have those moments. And it's really, are we going to go to our grave always living in this despair and never knowing? Or are we going to find out? That's what it really comes down to. Are we going to step up to that mark and say, okay, I'm going to investigate this. I'm going to start looking this up. I'm going to go down to find a priest, and I'm going to ask him. I'm going to say, well, what's the faith? Or I'm going to find a catechism, and I'm going to read what the church teaches. What is it that God wants me to know and to believe in order to be saved? What does he want me to do in order to obtain eternal happiness? Because the information is there. I mean, the greatest minds of the human race have discussed these questions. The greatest minds of the human race have left to us a written legacy discussing these things. And it's only too easy for us in our modern world of instant connections and Google and so on and so forth to just dismiss this accumulated wisdom and knowledge of the human race and just dismiss it on the grounds that we're more technologically advanced. We know better than people in the past. It's a bit of a fallacy. It is a bit of a fallacy. I think if any one of us were to attempt to engage in debate with any of the great minds of the past, I think we would be very thoroughly humiliated. These were very smart men, and with an ability to know knowledge. And you still see it.
They had nothing else to do. They had nothing else to do but be smart.
Yes, certainly some of them. Well, that's why we call them the liberal arts. In fact, is that people who had the time free to be able to study these things are the more cultivated classes. But nonetheless, even the basic, peasants of the Middle Ages still had a better grasp on reality than we do, because they were more in contact with the real life problems and real life solutions, whereas we are so connected to the world through this medium of a screen, which changes our viewpoint on reality. And we start to think that we know a lot when we can just Google things, but we don't know it. That knowledge actually doesn't mean anything to us. It doesn't change us as a person. That's why I think it was just so impressive just yesterday, and once again, referred to topical events, watching Amy Coney Barrett being asked, could she please show her notes to the Senate inquiry? And she held up this blank notepad. She doesn't need notes because she's made that her own. She's made that study and knowledge of law her own, and she's able to use it as real knowledge. There's not too many people who can do that. Most people are just so wrapped up in a superficial and a shallow world that they've missed the point. And that's why I think that they are somewhat condemned to despair. The really sad thing about it, Thomas, is that it's actually a part of the notion of despair is that you've given up looking for something to hope for. And so when those moments come, you just don't pursue it. Which is why it's always a wonderful thing if someone can touch the life of somebody else and give them that moment of hope by which they can then raise up and start to seek the truth. And it has happened in the history of the world. We've seen many examples of those sorts of things. The work of I can't remember all the details, but during the World Wars, when, for instance, Father Willie Doyle, chaplain to the Irish Rifles, he touched the life of many men, not just the Catholic soldiers to whom he was chaplain, but even to the Protestants. There's one of these famous stories of how he went over the top to get a dying Protestant who'd gone down, and he got out there, and the Protestant looked at him and said, "Oh, Father, I don't belong to your church," and Father Doyle just looked at him and said, "Yes, but you belong to my God." It's that must have touched the guy's life. He must have just realized that there was something more, because that just opens out a vista that would be completely unsuspected in the greatness of the human soul. That this man, Father Willie Doyle, was happy to risk his life to go over the top into no man's land for someone who wasn't even a Catholic, to whom he couldn't even give the sacraments, but he was there to be with him at the moment that he died. He thought that was important. And you just think, well, what difference did it make for this man in eternity? What moment, what act of hope did he make at that moment? You don't know, God knows, but it must have, surely, it must have touched him somehow. So that's, I hope that even people watching this will maybe think about it, maybe give it another go, to try and raise themselves from this dark world in which we live, and to realize that there is another world, there is another existence, and it's not necessarily something which I can see and which I can touch, but it's something which I can demonstrate to be true. If we're willing to, as we said last time, if we're willing to actually go and look for the evidence. It is there. It's there for those who look for it. But to just dismiss it is only too easy, unfortunately.
Father, beautiful. I love talking to you. That was such an interesting conversation. And I can't wait to do it all again next week, when we're going to talk about the last of the 3 theological virtues, being, if my memory serves me correctly, charity.
Yes, the virtue of charity. We'll certainly have an interesting discussion, I'm sure, on the virtue of charity.
Something I know very little about, unfortunately, but we'll hold that all over until next week.
Isn't that us all? Indeed.
All right.
Well, thank you very much,
Father.
Tom.
Thank you. Until next week.
Until next week. God bless.